Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 6th of August of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. First we're going to discuss the situation in Crimea, and we are also going to discuss the situation with the western part of Ukraine. These two regions are tightly connected within the situation that took place in these areas. And as you know, the Ukrainians during that day managed to make another attempt to attack the Russian bridges in the vicinity of Crimea that connected Crimea itself with the South Zaporozhye and Kherson region. We are talking about Ginichesk bridge, this one bridge that connects Ginichesk, let's say Ginichesk-Girka, and the second bridge in the vicinity of Changar. And when talking about the bridge in the vicinity of Changar, this is not the first attempt to attack from the Ukrainian side. That bridge was already damaged a few weeks ago, but Russians managed to create pontoon bridge and to repair that bridge, and currently there are no problems with this. But what is so important, what is so interesting with those attacks? The thing is that both these two bridges were attacked by Ukrainian Su-24 aircrafts and by Storm Shadow missiles. This is the first things, and we can say what is so important. This is not the first time when the Ukrainians were attacking these bridges with those attacks, with those missiles. And let's take a look at the results of those attacks. As you can see, the bridges were damaged, and furthermore we got also the video of those explosions. This explosion took place in the vicinity of Ginichesk. Another explosion took place in the vicinity of Changar. So the bridges were damaged. Of course, we can talk a lot about the connections, about supplying, supporting of Crimea and the mainland through these areas, but currently this is not the most important piece of news. Of course, as you can see, according to this picture, the bridges weren't damaged heavily, so the Russians still can have possibility to use them. Furthermore, they can establish pontoon bridges, but if you remember, when talking about Antonov Bridge, also the situation in the vicinity of that bridge started also with the small damages, but later that was the reason why the Russians took a decision to left Kherson area, because of like almost destroyed bridge. Furthermore, the Russians published the video of air defense system. According to this video, the author of this video claims that on this video we can see how the Russian air defense system Pantsir managed to shut down at least one Storm Shadow missile. According to the Ministry of Defense, there were at least 12 missiles, and 9 of them were shut down by the Russian air defense systems, and 3 of them managed to hit the bridges, and we saw the results of those attacks. So what is the most important piece of news, because this is not the first time when the Ukrainians attack this area? And the most important part is that that attack was made by Su-24, and the Ukrainian sources published the video of possible moment of launching of those Storm Shadow missiles by the Ukrainian Su-24 somewhere in the vicinity of Kherson. So basically, as a result of attack, this of course I can add it to this map softly, and so basically according to this information, the Ukrainians attack the bridge from in one direction and from another direction. Furthermore, according to the Ministry of Defense, there were 12 missiles. 9 of them were shot down by the Russians, and 3 of them managed to get the target. So if we take a look at these Su-24, we see that these Su-24 have possibility to use just 2 missiles at once. So that means that there were at least 6 Su-24 that were attacking the Russian positions, and this is a significant number of aircrafts that were attacking the Russian positions at one time. 6 Su-24. So okay, Su-624, this is not for the first time. The next question: which airport, which airfield the Ukrainians were using for that purposes, for those attacks? And according to information at least we have, there is just one airport and one aviation brigade that has Su-24 that were upgraded to use those Storm Shadow missiles. And we're talking about 7th Aviation Brigade, and the main positions of that 7th Aviation Brigade is on the airfield in the vicinity of Starokonstantinov. Okay, we understand the situation, so what is so important, what's new about this situation? And the thing is that during the previous night, the Russians made massive missile attack all over the entire Ukraine. There were a lot of explosions, and we have already discussed the situation with this airport in Starokonstantinov during the previous videos, and these red squares show us the areas of the main explosions in main, like fire in the vicinity of that airfield. If we take a look at this map, we understand that the Russians managed to destroy the fuel depot and probably probably few warehouses of that 7th Aviation Brigade. And one more time, this is the only brigade that, according to information we have, can use these Su-24 that were upgraded to use Storm Shadow missiles. Furthermore, we got a video of the results of those missile strikes. We see the fire brigades, fire machines, that the fire personnel that were trying to reduce the damage, trying to secure the situation in this area. But one more time, the Ukrainians were able to attack using 6 Su-24 the Russian bridges from the base that, according to information we have, was damaged and attacked by the Russian forces during the previous night. So the question I have, and the only logical conclusion that I can make during this situation, there are few things. First of all, as I see, the Russians can't see the Ukrainians' aircrafts. Maybe the Ukrainians are using some kind of technology, because there was like 6 aircrafts that launched out missiles, and neither of them was shut down by the Russian air defense. So the thing is that probably the Russians can't see these type of aircrafts. Maybe the Western countries managed to upgrade those aircrafts with some stealth technology, who knows. But also, this is not the most important topic. As I understand, the Ukrainians are using the following tactics. I think, it's my completely conclusion, you will not be able to find this piece of information anywhere else. The Ukrainians keep their Su-24 somewhere on the territory of Poland, on the NATO country, because this is the only secure way how to secure these aircrafts and to save them. Because the Russians attack the Ukrainians almost every single week. They're making massive missile attacks, and the tactics the Ukrainians use, they're doing the first jump from the territory of Poland on the very low level, and they're entering the territory of Ukraine, and for example, they're landing their ships, aircraft somewhere in the vicinity of Khmelnytsky aircraft. And after that, the Ukrainians making the next wave attack from aircraft of Khmelnytsky, and the Ukrainians are flying to the south, and somewhere from this direction, the Ukrainians attack some Novobuk, or even somewhere Pervomaisk or Krapivnitsky. The Ukrainians launch those missiles and attack the bridges. After that, those Su-24 turn their direction and start movement back in direction of Khmelnytsky aircraft. On Khmelnytsky, of course, those aircrafts landed, and after that, the Russians see the entire movement of those Su-24 from Khmelnytsky to the fire position. But after Khmelnytsky, the Ukrainians make another start of their flights, and they're flying back to the territory of Poland, and they're landing somewhere there. So this, I think that probably the Russians have already discovered this piece of information, but neither the Russians and the Western countries are able to provide this piece of information for people. First of all, if the Russians will tell people that the Ukrainians use the territory of Poland to attack Russian bridges in Crimea, of course, people on the ground, civilians and military experts and people, the population of Russia will require the president of Russian Federation to start attacking the territory of Poland and to start attacking the airports that Ukrainians use for those purposes. But the Russians can't do this because it will lead to the Third World War. And from the other side, the Western countries can't tell anybody that Ukrainians use the territory of Poland for these purposes, because I believe that that is already involvement of NATO in the conflict with Russia. And of course, for these purposes, you need to have permission also from people. So this situation is covered, and as I understand, both the Russians and the Western countries knows about this, but nobody wants to discover this piece of information because of big problems that this piece of news can bring for both sides, either for the Russians and for the Western countries. But as I understand, sooner or later, this piece of information will come true, and people will understand and realize the risks and the entire situation in this region. Furthermore, today we got another very interesting video. France have sent the Ukrainians another missiles, air to land missiles, Scalp. This is the French type of this is analog of Storm Shadow. Basically, this is the same missile, but with from another producer of this type of missiles. As you can see, Zelensky signed his words glory to Ukraine, and Now we see that the France have provided Ukrainians this type of missiles. We understand the France have their own reasons, and of course they have failed this situation in the Niger, in Mali, in Burkina Faso, in Senegal, and this is like just a regular act of revenge from the France for the Russians. Now let's move back. So this is my understanding of the situation. Anyway, sooner or later we're going to understand whether this piece of information is correct or probably maybe my speculation. Now we're moving to the ground and let's start discussing this topic. And first we're going to start with the Bradley Square. The Ukrainians during the day made another attempt to attack the Russian positions. That was a small reconnaissance in combat, probably reconnaissance in force. And after the Ukrainians started movements, the Russians managed to discover them. And after that, the Russians start bombing and shelling the Ukrainians, and as a result of that attack, the Ukrainians lost few armored vehicles and a few platoons of infantry. The main forces of Ukrainian infantry managed to land and to cover and to take their positions among the brushes and the forest lines in this area. We see the fresh video of destroyed Ukrainian armored vehicles. Like at least on this video, we see at least 3 new armored vehicles that were destroyed during the previous 24 hours. One more time, for now it's very difficult to understand the real ways and the real directions of Ukrainian attack, but basically we see that they were the same directions as we saw during the previous days. Furthermore, as we discussed in the previous videos, the Russians have already created new type of electronic warfare weapon to shut down and suppress the drones during any attempt of attack. Now we are moving further to the Vremivka tactical bridgehead. The Ukrainians launched another attack in that direction, but all the Ukrainian attacks were repelled by the Russians, and the battle has ended without any progress for the Ukrainians. So yet Urozhaine still remains under Russian control. The Russians are not planning to step back, and during those attacks, the Russians lost more. The Russians managed to repel the Ukrainian attack, and the Ukrainians lost more soldiers. The Ukrainians published some videos how they were bombing and shelling that settlement during the previous days before the Ukrainians launched that attack, so something like artillery preparation. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes in the Zaporozhye area, the Ukrainians lost 80 soldiers and 7 armored vehicles. So as you can see, the level of losses correlates with the activity in this area. We see that activity was reduced completely. The only interesting area I would like to point your attention to is direction in the vicinity of Gulay Polya. The Russians were bombing the Ukrainian positions in that area using tanks from hidden position. We can see on this video a small accumulation of Ukrainian reconnaissance team that probably were returning back from another reconnaissance operation, but the Russians didn't allow them to complete their mission, and using tanks and attacks, those reconnaissance team was destroyed. And this is not the first video from this region. Probably this is the second video from that area. Few weeks ago, there was another video from this almost the same tank. The Russians were bombing the Ukrainian positions in that forest line. So maybe that was not even a reconnaissance operation, but even some kind of rotation process that the Russians were trying to break, and as I understand, that attack was pretty successful. So the main movements of the Ukrainian forces in this area are lays along the railways. Now we're moving to the South Donetsk area. We got very interesting updates from this territory. The Ukrainians have activated their movements in this area, and first the Ukrainians during the previous days, while the clashes in Urozhaine and Staromayorsk, started accumulation of their forces along this defense belt in front of Novodonetsk. So this is the main defense belt of the Ukrainian forces. They started accumulation of the forces with the next attempt to attack in direction of Novovodane, and with another attempt to attack in direction of Novomayorsk, and of course to attack in direction of Shevchenkova. So these are 3 main settlements that Ukrainians will try to capture during the next waves of attacks. The Russians have already discovered the Ukrainian positions and started bombing the Ukrainians with artillery systems, with TOS flamethrower systems. For example, on this video we can see how the Russians discovered the Ukrainian accumulation of forces before probably the next attempt to attack, and after the reconnaissance teams sent the coordinates for the Russian artillery systems. The Russians start bombing and shelling Ukrainian positions and that forest line. Of course, we haven't received any numbers of results of those attacks, but anyways, understand nothing managed to survive after the attack of another TOS flamethrower system. And the Ukrainians have already also started some kind of preparation of upcoming offensive operation in this area by bombing and shelling the Russian trenches in the vicinity of Shevchenkova. And this video is very interesting because this video shows us the real position of Russian forces. And because the previous version of this map, according to my understanding, the Russians were to the south of this lake, but currently we see that Ukrainians were bombing these forest lines. So basically it confirms that the Russians have captured this lake and this riverside, and after that, of course, it reduced the chances for the Ukrainians to complete any successful operation to the south from this direction. The Russians reported that as a result of fierce fightings in the vicinity of South Donetsk area from, let's say, this Novomayorsk, Novodonetsk, Pavlovka, Vuhledar, Volodymyrivka, the Ukrainians lost 150 soldiers, so the level of losses is very heavy, as you can see. When talking about Donetsk area, as we discussed in the previous video, the Ukrainians, probably as an act of revenge against the situation in Kupyansk when the Russians attacked the blood centers, the Ukrainians bombed that Donetsk, the capital of DPR, with cluster rounds, and it's like, as you know, it's a real crime. It's a crime to attack the civilian area with the cluster shells. As I know, according to information we have, the Russians haven't attacked the Ukrainian cities with cluster rounds, never, ever since the beginning of the special military operation, but we see that Ukrainians have already opened this dangerous page. And the Russians Ministry of Defense reported that during the day they managed to repel few attacks in the vicinity of Marinka. And today also the Russians published the video how another reconnaissance team of Ukrainian forces were moving in direction between the ruins of Marinka. That reconnaissance team was discovered by the Russian special forces, and after that the Ukrainian reconnaissance team was attacked by all types of weapons the Russians have, and they forced the Ukrainians to stretch and to step back, and the Ukrainians were forced to step back, probably the forces of 79th Air Assault Brigade. When talking about Avdiivka, we haven't received anything, just a few updates from the Ukrainian side, how they were bombing and attacking the Russian position, just a regular routine without any changes on the ground. We haven't received nothing during the previous 24 hours about the situation in Krasnogorovka. After the Russians captured the positions along the railways, they took a small operational pause, and currently they're regrouping, and probably within the next 48 hours they will restart their offensive operation in the direction of Krasnogorovka. Furthermore, the Russians, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, reported that during the previous 24 hours the Ukrainians was the side who was trying to counterattack the Russians along the railways. All the Ukrainian attacks were repelled by the Russians, and the Ukrainians were forced to step back. And now there is a regrouping process from the Russian side. When talking about Klishchiivka, Bakhmut, Artyomovsk, we stopped receiving any updates from Klishchiivka. The Ukrainians, as I understand, took a decision not to continue any offensive operation. At least they, for now, they don't believe themselves. They see that they don't have possibilities to attack, to capture the settlement. The Russians are in defense state, and they're attacking the Ukrainians among the fields. The Ukrainians don't have even a settlement where they can hide and have their small base or at least some operational center. And the Ukrainians managed to capture the forest lines in the western part of Klishchiivka. The Russians controlled the situation. On this video we see how the Ukrainians landed their infantry and infantry capture took their positions in the trenches. The Russians, of course, controls everything, and as a result of drone attack, the Russians destroyed that trenches. I'm not sure that the Russians managed to deal a lot of damage because there is a lot of underground facilities, but anyway, just an episode of another strike in this area. So no changes in this area. When talking about the northern flank, the Ukrainians, after small regrouping, made an attempt to attack the Russian positions in the vicinity of Berkhivka and Yahidne. During the previous days, the Ukrainians were bombing and shelling the Russians in this area, and this is not the first attempt of attack by the Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainians, first they were trying to secure their flanks. On this video we see how the Ukrainians managed to discover the Russian ammo depot somewhere between Dubovo, Vasilivka, Orikhovo, Vasilivka and Grigorovka, and the Ukrainians dropped the bomb, and then we got a very powerful explosion. Basically the Russians lost probably a very powerful operational ammo depot Orikhovo, somewhere in the forest between Dubovo-Vasilievka and Grigorivka. Also, the Ukrainians were bombing the Russian positions in Dubovo-Vasilievka. All these events took place exactly these days. The Ukrainians attacked the Russian positions in Yahidne and Berkhivka. They also destroyed another position or even ammo depot, and after that artillery preparation, the Ukrainians launched their offensive operation. This is the episode of yesterday's attempt of Ukrainian side to capture or to penetrate the Russians' defense belt in the vicinity of Yahidne. The Ukrainians were attacking from along the railways in direction of Yahidne. The Russians managed to discover, and using artillery system, they managed to destroy at least 2 armored vehicles. The Ukrainians were moving along the railways in direction of Yahidne, and today the Ukrainians made another attempt to attack. The Russians reported that as a result of those clashes, the Ukrainians were using at least 2-3 tanks and 3 personal carriers, armored personal carriers. 2 tanks were destroyed and 1 personal carrier was destroyed as well. When talking about the losses, the Ukrainians had at least 10 soldiers wounded and around 5 were killed as a result of that offensive operation that Ukrainians were trying to implement during the night period of time. And the Russians also published the video of those attacks that the Russians were bombing the Ukrainians while they were moving along the fields. Anyway, that attack was repelled by the Russians and the Ukrainians were forced to step back. As I understand, that was another reconnaissance operation by the Ukrainian forces. Probably that was reconnaissance in force, not reconnaissance in combat. But anyway, that operation haven't gave Ukrainians nothing, just losses. Very interesting updates are coming from the northern flank of Artyomovsk, and this is the area where the Russians are advancing. And today the Russians published another video of bombing and shelling the Ukrainian positions on the Siversk bridgehead in the vicinity of Vuhledar. The Russians are bombing the Ukrainian positions along the railways and west to the east of the railways. And basically, the Russians also use the cluster rounds, as you can see on this video. And basically, the Russians are trying to clear the movements of their and to clear the passage, the safe road for the Russian forces that they will be able to use along the railways. What is so interesting in this video, and if we will increase the number of updates, that during this month, just during the August, the Russians have already published 3 videos, and as you can see, all of these videos are along the railways. This is the first video that we got from this area, was published by the Ministry of Defense. The Russians just were bombing the Ukrainian positions using the mortar system known as. A little bit to the north, the Russians were bombing, we got this video today, the Ukrainian positions and trenches and fortifications, and a few days ago we got another video of usage of guided bombs, and as a result of that attack, the Ukrainians lost a very powerful stronghold. Anyway, we see that the Russians are clearing their passage, and I expect that after the end of artillery preparation and clearing artillery preparation, the Russians will continue movements along the railways, trying to force the Ukrainians to step back. And of course, the main target in this operation is going to be Vuhledar. Of course, it's going to be a very difficult operation from the Russian side, but we understand the value of this operation, and if the Russians are able to complete this operation, this is going to be the full collapse of Ukrainian defense in this area. This settlement, this territory will be split in 2 parts. The Ukrainians can say goodbye to any northern offensive operation, and they will basically be forced to step back from Razdolovka and Veselye in direction of Kuzyumovka. So basically they will be forced to establish their defense positions along the railways that goes from, let's say, Vuhledar to Siversk. If the Russians can clear the railways in this area and to make a powerful push to the northern direction. Basically, this is exactly what the Russians are trying to implement currently. Now we're moving further to the north. Let's finish with Donetsk area. The Russians reported that as a result of fierce fightings on Donetsk area, the Ukrainians lost 170 soldiers and 8 armored vehicles. When talking about Kupyansk and Liman, we haven't received almost nothing. I'm talking about geolocations. The Ministry of Defense reported about clashes, about offensive operation in this area. A lot of mappers have already updated their maps, showing this area, with this forest in the vicinity of Karamazinovka under Russian control, and probably nothing special happened there. The level of losses is not so heavy. On Liman, the Ukrainians lost 110 soldiers. On the Kupyansk front line, the Ukrainians lost 50 soldiers. The Russians published a lot of videos from the Novoselovska. For example, in this video we see an episode of Russian offensive operation, just a few attacks, few explosions, few artillery strikes. On this video we see how the Russians managed to clear the settlement, and after that they start bombing and shelling the forest lines and trenches of the Ukrainians around the settlement. And these settlements, of course, which confirms the combat line, which confirms the Ukrainian positions and the Russian positions in this area. When talking about Kupyansk, the Russians continue saying and reporting that they managed to advance and they managed to develop the Russian positions in the vicinity of Vilshany, in the vicinity of Sinkovka, Takarovka, and of course in the vicinity of Petropavlovka. But yet we haven't received any updates about capturing of even single settlement. And one more time, I'll remind you that during the previous night, the Russians made another bombing attack using guided bombs against the Ukrainian blood transfusion center. And a lot of soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, wounded soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers were destroyed as a result of that attack. And as an act of revenge, the Ukrainians start bombing and shelling Donetsk with the cluster rounds. So that was terrible night, of course. Now let's move a little bit from the situation in Ukraine. And of course, a lot of people have questions about the situation in the Black Sea and how the Russians are going to solve the issues with the ships, with the supply and supporting this area and so on. Today we got a very interesting picture of the Russian rivers, and basically this is the Russian river logistic that the Russians use for redeploying of the ships. So basically I'm not saying about the modern nuclear submarines, but sometimes some types of ships, of boats, the Russians can redeploy, let's say from the Baltic Sea, from the Northern Sea, from Caspian Sea to the Black Sea using the local rivers. So for the Russians there are no problems for supplying, supporting and reinforcing the military group in this area. The only question is that currently the ships is not the type of weapon that the Russians need to use in the Black Sea against the Ukrainian Navy drones. They need to find a solution of their own Navy drones for these purposes. Now we are moving to Saudi Arabia. As you know, today there was the first day of negotiation process between the 30 countries. They were discussing the peace agreement of Ukraine. A lot of countries were involved in to these events, including United States of America, Great Britain, India, and others. Furthermore, China was on that event, took place, and the countries were discussing the situation with Ukraine, the possible peace agreement. And the experts are saying that the most important from that meeting in Riyadh is that the Ukrainians are no longer insist on their Ukrainian peace model. Currently, nobody even talked about that. Currently, people are talking about the new model that will be implemented by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. So this is the situation about the Ukrainians and their plans regarding restoring control over entire Ukraine. When talking about Niger and about Nigeria and about the situation, as you know, as we discussed, Wagners have been already redeployed at least some forces to this area, and as you know, today is the last day of ultimatum from the African countries to restore the legal form of power in Niger. So we'll see what is going to be the next steps of the Western countries, but something tells me that I'm not sure that African countries are willing to spill their blood for the Western interest or something like this. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.